All right, so this is It Happened in Moore County, a great book. Read it 3 times just to make sure I had it. Moore County is interesting. There's so much that's happened here. My family and I, we got here in 2005, and we seem to be learning about Moore County each and every day. Larry Koster put this book together, and these are just small snippets of what has happened. It's not the full story, but there is so much backstory to each and every one of these. And I've noticed a common theme that 6, 7, or 8 different events sort of intertwine. We were talking about how we touched and reached several of the presidents that have come and gone through Moore County with the Kennedy Rifle Company and and the gold mines and other things. Really, really interesting information. Here we go. So without further ado, It Happened in Moore County, straight from Larry Koster's book. Again, small snippets. Now, we're going to start from the north and we're going to work our way down south. I'm going to start up here in Robbins. Interesting fact is there was gold here in Moore County. We were the first sort of state that had gold here in Moore County from 1800 to about 1823. Okay? And it's carried on all the way to about 1848. And of course, we know what happened in 1848. We had this great big gold rush out in San Francisco, out in California. I think they did a bit of a better job capitalizing on that gold rush. They named a football team after it. They painted their helmets chrome and gold colored and crimson. We did not capitalize as well. But this continued all the way up to 1848. And to this day, we still have about 12 dozen or so, a little over 12 gold mines still up in the Robbins area. You can see right off of Highway 2427. However, most of them are on private property right now, so you may want to knock on the door before you just go out there and start mining for gold. Interesting fact, but we were in fact the first to have gold. Another little interesting thing, this gold rush, just like the one in California, brought a lot of people of notoriety here. One of the ones that I thought was real interesting was Thomas Edison. Okay, now he came in a little late to the party. He got here around in the 1890s, and we can kind of ascertain that because the Sanford Express printed in their article June 21st, 1890, 2 weeks ago, the great inventor Thomas Edison came down to Moore County to take an option out on some land. And guess where that land was? Up in Robbins along Highway 2427, where all the gold was at. Okay, very interesting. As we move on, one of my favorites, and it's so nice, as I was coming in, I heard somebody talking about being a member of the Kennedy family. Not John F. We're going to go with John Alexander, though. Okay, where he started out, born in the 1750s, moved over, emigrated here to the United States, up just outside of Philadelphia, and started his gunsmithing up in Philadelphia. Moved down where he had his son David, who would ultimately take over the operations. Some of the things that's really interesting about the Kennedy Rifle Company, obviously it was one of the ones that they were very, very specific in their craftsmanship. The way they managed their rifling was top of the line. And not only that, their sight alignment, their sight adjustments were precise. When we see evidence of this in the Revolutionary War, where colonial soldiers, Washington soldiers, are shooting redcoats out to 250 yards. And that's phenomenal for that day. You're thinking in the late 1700s, 1770s, into the 1780s. That's phenomenal shooting. Now, they were in such high demand because of their quality and their craftsmanship. In 1809, they made 650 rifles for $25 a rifle. That's pretty phenomenal. I mean, $25 in 1809 is a lot of money. Now, how do we tie this to a president of the United States? Well, future President Andrew Jackson is fighting out the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. We already know that the Battle of New Orleans really would have no bearing on the outcome of the war because sort of a peace, an armistice had already been reached. But sort of the last large shipment of Kennedy rifles had left Moore County en route to New Orleans to support the Battle of New Orleans. So just some interesting stuff. Now, if you're you're in the market for one of these, I do know where there is one. I'm sure they're not going to part with it, but it hangs up in the Shaw House right to this day, and it's in beautiful condition. I mean, you're talking from, you know, sort of an early 1900, late 18th century piece, phenomenal. And I would tell you that the craftsmanship is just amazing. Even by today's standards, the rifling and the bore sighting are phenomenal. Let's go ahead and move on. All right, we're going to head up to Jugtown now. Everyone knows about Jugtown. I grew up, as you know, in Long Island, and we'd go into New York City, we'd head up to Greenwich, and we heard all about the North Carolina pottery. Okay, now, I'm pretty young, I'm about 29, so in the 70s and 80s, I knew about Jugtown pottery. But to be honest with you, Jugtown pottery, it really had a challenging period. So shortly after the Civil War, we had this thing called the Reconstruction Era. Okay, and now when the North came down and try to help reconstruct the South, it really didn't go too well. I mean, history kind of tells us that. When the South came back and we reconstructed ourselves. And what absolutely helped the Jugtown pottery is Jacques and Juliana Busby, artists from Raleigh, had some ties to New York, okay, to Greenwich Village. And what they did is they decided that they were going to go ahead and move some of this incredible pottery up there to see if they could find a market for it. Lo and behold, they found a great market, and thus we sort of see this resurgence here, Jugtown pottery, North Carolina pottery specific, right here in Moore County, and it was pretty phenomenal. So what you see here, now obviously this is not Jacques and Juliana Busby, but Alice sitting by the fire in a village store. So interesting fact, Jugtown pottery almost was a foregone by a conclusion that it was ending, but some North Carolinians from Raleigh came down, sort of found a niche market up there in New York, and I'm telling you, to this day, it's still very, very popular. And it's, fortunately for all of us, it's very popular here as well. Okay, so let's talk about a story of success and a story of failure. We'll see a lot of this here just by means of the way we started to inhabit and migrate in and out of North Carolina. So we're going to talk about Parkwood. Parkwood was considered a company town, where it was sort of a mill town, and a company came in and they grind up the millstone from local stones in the quarries and whatnot, and it was very, very successful for a long period of time. At its height, it had about 100 residents. Okay, so it was a well-established community, if you will. It had a store, it had a hotel, it had a sawmill, and it had various other shops where people would go and shop, just as we do down here in Southern Pines or Pinehurst or up there in Carthage. And in 1895, shortly after the Civil War, times were tough. And what ended up happening was the town, nobody came to the town, and nobody started working within the town, and then the residency started to fail. So in about 1895, we had about 25 residents in Parkwood. And then shortly after that, there was just one single caretaker. And he stayed on well into 1946, just shy of 1946, and the place became a ghost town. Now, I kind of fancy some of the ghost towns. I like to go into them and walk around, and I sort of create my own sort of history. But now we actually have some empirical data on what happened here. And sadly, in 1946, there was a fire. And so sort of the last remnants of Parkwood are really hard to find now. But again, it was absolutely a success story. Up to 100 personnel, shops and stores, bustling little town. And now it's just a mere landmark in our society. Okay. We're going to move to Carthage. And while we're on the theme of fires, this next slide we see here, that is the County Courthouse. And in 1895, I know what you're thinking, this doesn't look like it's very attractive. It's because it suffered a fire. Okay, another fire. And it absolutely ran through the building and burned everything up. So we have no official records before 1895. So, I'm sorry, 1889. So we have no marriage deeds, we have no land grants, we have no mortgage deeds, any of that information, because it was all housed right here. Right here as sort of the county seat. But all's not lost, because Carthage has survived, and it's maintained its status within our community. And some of the things that sort of helped, and we were talking about him on the way in, Andrew Johnson, future president at this time. He came down here in 1824, long before he'd become the 17th president of the United States, and I'm sure everybody's pretty confident that they know the story how he became president of the United States. What I find interesting about Andrew is he had a tailor shop in Carthage, and he sold high-end suits. So some of you are thinking, yes, suits that I probably would not be able to purchase, but they were affordable to everybody. But they were high quality. Did I lose myself? Hello?
Probably.
Okay, well I can talk really loud. I'm kind of used to that. Give me a second, I'll just look at this. Is it back? Perfect. Oh, I must have hit the pause button. It's a brain housing group thing, I apologize. But so he crafted these wonderful suits, very high-end suits, high-quality suits. But most of the residents pretty much assumed that he fancied talking politics more than he did sort of putting together suits and hemming up, suits. And obviously now we know why. In hindsight, being 2020, he had a vision, and I'm not sure we sort of had a notion back then that he was actually going to be running for office, okay? But again, he originates, from Raleigh, around the Raleigh area, came down here to Moore County, settled in Carthage for a few years, about 1824, and had a very, very, very profitable business, talking politics too. All right. Now, here's one of the most successful businesses over quite a long period, about a half century of time. Okay, this is the famous Tyson and Kelly Buggy Company. Whoops.
Oh my God, Buggy Company.
All right, so we got some family in the area. All right, stand up. Okay, so we didn't expect that outburst. We're glad you're here. All right, so it was one of the most noted businesses in Moore County. It was the largest buggy company in the mid-1850s and was originally known as the Tyson and Kelly Buggy Company. And it was one of the leading buggy companies in the Southeast for more than 50 years, and clearly the leading buggy company here. Now, some empirical data that allows us to understand why it was so successful. In 1890, the factory turned out approximately 3,000 horse-drawn buggies. This is pre-assembly line. This is pre-Model T. This is handcrafted people working the buggies each and every day. Now I'm going to let that young lady know we're going forward again.
Go ahead.
You good? Okay. So, I guess we don't need to know. I'll go ahead and introduce William T. Jones. Okay. William T. Jones would ultimately be one of the partners in this business and pretty much run the business. Now, there's some really interesting facts about William T. Jones. He's a black man. This picture does not do him justice. African American.
He is. Are you related, ma'am? Are you related to him? I wish. Oh, okay.
Oh,
all right.
you must work in the factory.
No, I live there.
Oh, okay, there you go. So, and interesting, he was born a slave. He was born in slavery. And he started working at the company as a painter. He did all of the paint work on the buggies. Then the Civil War unfolded. He joined the Confederate Army and served as a lieutenant. So here's clearly an African-American man in a very poor situation was able to rise to the rank of an officer in the Confederate Army. A very smart individual. So smart that when he was in captivity, he made a whole lot of money. He was able to go ahead and take all the food leftovers and everything and turn it into alcohol. And he would sell it back to the people that were guarding him, and he'd sell it back to his fellow inmates. And so he got quite a reputation for a guy that could do a lot of things with limited means. Okay? Very, very, very interesting. Then, as you know, he'll come back after the Civil War, and he'll slowly but surely take this company to great prominence. Okay? And then we know what happens right around 1910. The company will fall on some hard times, financial times, and then obviously with the intervention of motorized vehicles, the Buggy slowly becomes phased out over the course of time. But a great story of success right here in Moore County. Okay, right up there, probably your neck of the woods. Yeah. All right. So while we're on the theme of transportation, this is one of my favorite sort of pictures. I have driven on Plank Road going from Southern Pines to Fort Bragg 1,000 times. And then I've gotten on the other side of Fort Bragg and headed out into Fayetteville, and I always thought to myself, I wonder why it's called Plank Road. You know, there's nothing that would dictate to me that it would be called Plank Road. Here's why it's called Plank Road. Because it was 129 miles of planks laid down between Fayetteville and Forsyth County, specifically Salem. 129 miles. Now, the interesting thing about this is, about every 11 miles, you'd see a home. And in that home would be the toll collector. And he would collect tolls for everybody that traversed, okay, their horse and carriage and their buggies and along Plank Road. And it was no more than 4 cents a mile. Okay, but that was his job. Now, the toll collector, he was paid $150 a year. That's really good money. But obviously with Plank Road, you can see one critical flaw in their thinking. It's one way. So the rule was, who had the largest caravan got to stay on the plank. Who had the smallest caravan had to come off to the side of the plank. And so you can see the heated arguments when people of the same size caravan got into it with each other. And of course it never happened where the toll collector was, because he was the one that sort of quelled any of the commotion and sort of did the 1800s version of rock, paper, scissors to see who was going to go ahead and move forward. Now, again, interesting, we now know what this 129 miles of road. I would suggest you don't try to stay on it while you go through Fort Bragg, because some of it does go sort of over the ordnance field, although they have maneuvered a little bit of it around Fort Bragg. So now we all know what we're doing when we travel on Fort Bragg, on Plank Road, and why it won't let us go through Fort Bragg. All right, so we're going to come down a little further south here. Now I've got another interesting question when we hit here, one we haven't answered. So, Annie Oakley. Annie Oakley, one of the world's preeminent early marksmen of her time. She was here from about 1916 to 1922 with her husband Frank Butler. And she was clearly one of the finest marksmen of her time. And the only question I'm trying to answer is that a Kennedy rifle in her hands? I'm thinking it's not, but I want to make that connection at one time or another. Now, it is said that she has taught nearly 15,000 women in her time to shoot a rifle. Okay? And here we see some of these lovely looking women standing on their own version of Plank Road, and they're taking lessons from Annie Oakley. Okay? Now, this is interesting. This is a vineyard called Vena Vista, and it's a bottling company. Now, this is along Highway 5, and you can see it's between what we call Aberdeen down to the south and Pinehurst to the north. And I've traveled that along a lot of time, and so has everyone else, because a lot of times it's just an easier way to get in and out of town. Now, along Highway 5, this bottling company, it was called Vena Vista, and the site was a Murray's Vineyard. Okay, Murray's Vineyard had about 100 acres of Scuppernong grapes. Scuppernong. I had to look that up. I don't drink much wine. It would have said,
You don't drink that one.
oh, I don't drink that wine. But again, this was very successful as early as 1898. Okay, it was pretty thriving. It's obvious that they had the vineyard there and they had the bottling company, so it was sort of a 2-for-1 deal, and they were able to get it out, to distribute it pretty locally as far as what was then Raleigh and parts just beyond. So again, we've had vineyards as late as 1898 into the early 1900s. All right. Southern Pines. Okay. Now, long before there was golf, I apologize, and Pinecrest football, we had other things going on here. All right. In 1781, what we see here is sort of Colonel Alston, an American patriot, got himself into a little bit of a I'd say a scuffle at the Alston House. Has anybody been to the Alston House? It's fantastic. They do a great rendition of it every year. It's called the House and the Horseshoe. Well, before that whole House and the Horseshoe ordeal took effect, down here in Southern Pines, sort of over by the lake here, he kills a loyalist farmer named Kenneth Black. Okay, Kenneth Black was relatively innocent. Okay, as much as we can sort of ascertain, and it took place right around Mills Pond. So that's the Mills Pond sits on sort of the Aberdeen Southern Pines border there. Today, through the great work of the Moore County Historical Society, bringing together the community, you can visit sort of the restored Kenneth Black Cemetery, and it's behind Chick-fil-A. So you grab a lunch, you go back there, and I'm telling you, they've done a fantastic job back there. They brought Boy Scouts in there, and they were actually able to, one of the Steady was able to go ahead and teach us how to sort of find the bodies that were buried in the ground, and some other folks using some very archaic tools. I'd use the term archaic, but it was so much fun. The young boys were just completely engrossed. Another group, a young man who was actually related to Kenneth Black, came in and sort of did the whole restoration piece, made sure it was done first class by the Moore County Historical Society. But in retaliation to this event, we see the storming of the Alston House. Okay, and so obviously the Miss Alston. Now here's an interesting little thing. We talk about having strong women in our lives. That goes back generations. It just didn't start last year. She comes out and basically saves the day. She brokers the peace between the two warring parties and inevitably saves the house. And that's why it's still standing to this day. So if you get a chance, get out there. It's about a couple months now since I've been out there, probably bordering on a year. But you can still see some of the bullet holes. It's restored really well. They do a fantastic job. But that's some history right here with the Revolutionary War that's taking place right here in Moore County. It's fantastic. All right, gonna move on. Now, did you know? Southern Pines, downtown, almost burned to the ground. Yeah, April 13th, 1921. Okay, think about the materials we were using back then to construct our buildings. A lot of brick, a lot of wood, a lot of tar. Okay, a lot of flammable items. So the fire began in the vicinity of a hotel on West Broad Street between Pennsylvania Avenue and New Hampshire. Clearly it's not there any longer. The only thing that didn't burn down was the Citizens Bank building. And that's still standing. Okay. The interesting thing about that, that's now an ice cream shop or an ice cream parlor. Okay, so you can still kind of frequent the downtown area. That's obviously been reconstructed, rebuilt, and today I think it's can I say the word pretty? It's a very pretty, it's a very enticing little town to walk through. But it was almost one of those lost towns, if you will, because it burned pretty good to the ground. So, a positive note. Let's get positive. Now, this isn't the New York Mets, okay? Unfortunately, this is the Philadelphia Phillies. All right, Philadelphia Phillies would come down here in the early 1900s, 1901, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and they would have their winter season down here, sort of their spring training camp. And where it's now called, it was the Southern Pines Country Club, it's now the Elks Club. And literally, I can walk out my backyard and throw a stone about 150 feet and probably walk where some of these great baseball players had walked. Okay, so it's now the Southern Pines Country Club. Now, this is an incredible story, and especially as of late, when we talk about tearing the trees down and changing the way we do business. Whoa, heavens to Murgatroyds. Here we go. So this, and this little box you see here, I had a pointer, but everybody can see that red box. That is the Southern Pines to Pinehurst trolley, okay, which obviously no longer runs, okay. It would go from the train station here in Southern Pines to downtown Pinehurst. What's interesting, it ran from about 1896 to 1905, and then it stopped running. Now, the story behind it is contentious. The story behind why it's contentious is some folks from Pinehurst came down and basically put a sign up that said the Pinehurst Junction, the Pinehurst, trolley junction. Well, the people of Southern Pines didn't like that very much, so the sign got sort of imbued with not so nice materials. It ultimately was pulled down, and then shortly after that, it was sort of unanimously decided that the trolley would no longer run. Now, Midland Road, it left here and it went straight up Midland Road and into Pinehurst. Well, the trolley tracks actually were the middle of the road where the trees are now. So after it went down, sort of in the 1930s, they started planting trees down along Midland Road. And now that's why you have one-way traffic on the left and one-way traffic on the right-hand side. It's because we had this trolley that would run between the two towns. I mean, interesting little fact, who would have thought down here we would have a trolley running? That'd be great. Kids today would be all over it. I probably would too. All right. Now, I'm going to be careful when I talk about this because it's been in the paper a little bit lately. We have a little town called Niagara. So if you head out the other way, out by Route 2, and you cross over by the right over to the tracks there, you'll see sort of the remnants of a small town, and that's called Niagara. And there's a sign on the tracks that say, "Welcome to Niagara." Again, one of those interesting little things. But Niagara was sort of a planned community. And within that community, in 1912, there were 20 homes built, a post office, a general store, a small hotel, a railroad depot, and the library, which still stands to this day. The post office was established in March of 1904, though. So we kind of went in there, established this thing, and then once you get a post office, well, then everything else will come. It's sort of like build it and they will come. And it got to its height about 1912, where there's about 20 homes. The community in Niagara obviously is taken from the Niagara grapes, or a variety of the Niagara grape. And to this day, we still have a little bit of it left. You can walk the land. The 20 homes are long gone, and I think there's a restoration, some sort of process, some sort of programming process to see what's going to happen with this. But very interesting little community. It certainly didn't take off. When you look at it, as it started to gain momentum, the 1920s was a great time. However, down here, we started to fall on harder times a little bit earlier than everybody else. Sort of in that economic band up in the Northeast, and then obviously once the '29 crash came, it's a foregone by conclusion that this was not going to survive. But Moore County did everything it possibly could to ensure success down in here. This is an interesting one, Sweetheart Lake. As I looked at this and I started to do some research, it was really interesting. There was a lot of money put into Sweetheart Lake. It was sort of a resort, if you will. And the way they did is they sort of put a cement slab down along one of the lakes, and it dammed up. So now we had a lake they dammed up one of the rivers. You had a lake, and then they put this great big facility out here. And just for a couple things, it had a 40-foot square reception room where you could hold functions. 40-foot square, that's huge. It's about, you have to go out about another 20 feet over here. And for the early 1920s, this was a huge undertaking. Simply because a lot of the attractions that brought us here certainly weren't the ones that were keeping us here. Okay, so we start to see, and when we're talking about come down to the south and you'll get the warm weather, get some golfing in, and now we have this sort of Sweetheart Lake, which is targeting a whole different sort of population base, if you will. But interesting, one of the things that I found and then I researched was the Jackson Spring Orchestra would come quite often. And so I know we have some musicians in the house, and I just want to note the Jackson Spring Orchestra is still alive and well. Probably been sucked up by the Moore County Orchestra. Well, it did not survive. It was one of those good ideas. However, it certainly did not survive. Yes, ma'am. We have.
Where was it?
That's the interesting piece. I've spent the last 9 days looking, because when I looked when I looked in the book, it says a river was dammed up with a cement slab. And so now, as you can imagine, and here's if I'm ever invited back, which is, you know, it's a crapshoot. I plan on having that information because I want to kind of walk the ground and find out where Sweetheart Lake is now.
It's in Hog Island.
Hog Island.
Yes.
Where's that?
Oh, I've seen that on the map. I've seen Hog Island.
Near where Lake Bay Road intersects Young Road.
Out of Young's Road, because that would be the northeastern end of Southern Pines, where we up to Young's Road out there where the horse farm is.
If you go out Young Road and you get to the point where you would go left on bear to the left, and Lake Bay Road takes off to the right. It's in that quadrant between Young Road and Lake Bay Road.
Is the lake still there?
Yeah, I'm going to find out, I promise you.
The lake is still there?
Yeah, there's a lake still there.
This is the kind of stuff that is so interesting about our community. We've done so much, and it's going to be great to capture this. Because I had no clue, and I looked everywhere. And you know, Google's only as good as your fingers allow it to be.
So it's not the lake at Lakeview?
No, ma'am.
Okay.
Not according to this gentleman here. It's down off Young's Road by Lake Beirut.
I'm not sure if it's I'm not sure if it's within the confines of Walter R. Moss Foundation or not, but they fox hunt there.
Right. I know where that's
The
at.
Moore County Hounds fox hunt.
Yes, sir.
The Sweetheart Lake area.
We're going to find out. Great question. All right. Let's head down to Aberdeen. And again, here's, you know, when you have such a rich history, things come and go. I have driven by this, as many of you have, and I often wondered, was this a bus stop? Or I allowed my imagination to play with itself, and I thought, I bet once upon a time there was an incredible mansion. Right? That's what I thought. Well, this is called a community. This was to be an established community called Montevideo Park. Okay, and what you see here, now this is on Poplar Street as you head from Southern Pines down to Aberdeen. And it's off to the right-hand side as we leave. And then obviously if you're coming from Aberdeen, it's on your left-hand side. But this was an established community or a planned community in 1927. And it was to have a building, 4-story hotel that would be able to have 227 guest rooms. Now, so what you got to kind of put your arms around was the population base here in Moore County for 227. Okay, we had other very successful hotels at the time as well. Okay, so and what's going to happen here in 2 to 3 years is really going to impact sort of what some of these early pioneers have planned to do with our county. It had a ballroom seating 1,000 people. Okay, it also was planned for a golf course, riding stables, tennis courts, and a number of homes. Okay, and these are still standing today, and they're amazing. I've seen people pull off to the side of the road and actually take pictures. Okay, now here's sort of a representation of the proposed hotel, sort of along the Aberdeen Southern Pines border. Beautiful.
How far did it get along?
Yeah, and who were the people who were doing this?
The people, these are some great questions here.
You'll have to come back.
I'll tell you, that's a good way to get me back. Tell the Moore County folks. So, the place was actually Frank Maples was one of the founders. Frank Maples, he had laid out the entire golf course, so he was one of the founders of this. And if you're truthfully interested, when I come back, I'll have this in great detail. But Frank Maples was one of the sort of the leading founders of this entire endeavor.
And the money that would have been involved in that would be
Now,
fascinating.
amazing, because it was over the 530 acres. 530 acre plot of land, and 12 of the 18 miles of road had already been laid. So when you're looking at the layout now of that whole area down there, this was already a planned community, so they fell in on this.
Is it related to Ellis and Dan Maples?
From West End?
No, these were the golf course.
Yes, the golf, yes.
It was their family.
Yes, sir. Now, from my understanding, there was a collective that were actually coming together, but he was one of the preeminent figures that sort of was pushing this sort of community. But, yes, sir.
This is not pronounced like the city in South America. It's not pronounced Montevideo. When they built this facility, they pronounced it Montevideo.
Montevideo.
Montevideo is the way they pronounce it.
That's how I'm going to say it from here on out. That's interesting.
That is the way they call it Montevideo. They did not call it Montevideo.
Isn't that odd? I bet there's a backstory. There's something we could find out. Yeah, that's great. Boy, I tell you what. But unfortunately, yeah, no, I never would have figured that out. These Spanish gateways are the only thing that remain, okay, to this day. And obviously some of the hard-packed roads have been refurbished over time, and they still exist. But it did not come to fruition like it was planned because of the Great Depression, okay?
I thought they had moved a couple of those.
So they had them at all four entrances, from the east, the west, the south, and the north. And the ones that remain today are the ones on North Poplar. I'd be interested to see if there were others.
I think there's a couple more.
That'd be worth the field trip. Sort of get a lunchbox together and we'll all go. I'm a closet history geek. I'll be honest with you, and I really am a sort of a history nerd, and I enjoy things like this. So this is fantastic. Montevideo.
Well, part of the country, right, was a driving theater.
Right, there was a drive-in theater.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure about the 1920s. I'd have to look. Okay. Now, here's where I promised my wife I would be very specific, because I'm pretty sure I could talk at length about Camp Mccall. Having done training there, having done a lot of service down there, just being sort of a military guy. But, I mean, we talked about the success and the grandeur that is Moore County. We talked about how we played a role sort of in the Revolutionary War. We played a role in the Civil War. Okay, we played a role in basically the defense of our country from the time it started to the Great World War II, and obviously nowadays with our young men and women. But Camp Mccall, within inside of 4 months, went from a plot of land in southern Moore County to an incredibly, incredibly large, bustling military camp. Now it's 1/10 of what it used to be because we don't have 30,000 plus soldiers in Camp Mccall. We've moved them up to Fort Bragg. But just some real interesting things. It's on 62,000 acres of land. Okay? And again, when it opened up inside of 4 months, 65 miles of paved road. Okay, between the Army Corps of Engineers, between engineers here in Moore County, in Cumberland County, and across North Carolina. A lot of work. Obviously, this was a huge undertaking. It had a 1,200 person hospital bed built. We're talking 4 months. Today, 4 months, I'm not sure we can get a house built. I digress, I'm sorry. Probably have to edit that piece. But also, it had 5 incredibly well functioning movie theaters. We just want one. Okay? 6 huge beer gardens. I thought that was interesting. 6 huge beer gardens. And an airfield with 3 5,000-foot runways. Okay? 5,000 foot. I'm not an Air Force guy, but I have landed on some airfields in a parachute in my life. You could fit pretty much any jet on that thing. Okay? Any one of our C-130, C-141, or C-17 airlifters. Okay? But there were over 30,000 soldiers stationed here. And today, as you know, we all know here, this is the home to where our Special Forces earn their Green Beret. Okay? So they go through this, sort of this 18-month pipeline, and they frequent Camp Mccall. And now we do the Robin Sage here, and it's based out of Camp Mccall, where a lot of individuals will go ahead and sort of be an opposing force or all kinds of different things to help these guys learn their trade craft. And it's a really well-run system. But long before it was trained in Green Berets, because we know John F. Kennedy is the one that sort of anointed the Special Forces soldier in the Green Beret back during his presidency, we had planned an operation. Okay, it was up until 1989 and the airborne and air-land assault invasion on Panama. This was the largest mock invasion in the continental United States. And it incorporated thousands and thousands of airborne soldiers. Now remember, airborne was brand new. Okay, we had the 11th Airborne, which was sort of their test pilot. And now we're getting the 101st and the 82nd sort of doing their mock invasion. Again, it had over 200 airplanes and 10,282 paratroopers. There were other sort of places that we did this around the country, but we were preparing for what? The Normandy invasion. Okay?
What year was it? Yes.
Oh, you don't think I have the answer to that, huh? I'm a military history guy. 1943. Okay? So it was 1943. So the military, the United States, were planning for a long time. Yeah, well, much older. Yeah. So this is a really interesting photo. I could go on for days. I apologize. But this is sort of an aerial photograph of Camp Mccall. Now, the other interesting thing, okay, that Larry Koster talks about in his book, part of the invasion was on the airport, the Moore County Airport. They used part of that so that they could drop paratroopers onto the Moore County Airport. Because one of the objectives is you jump onto the airport, the enemy airfields, you secure it, nobody else can fly in or out. They can't bring their supplies in or out, and more importantly, we can bring our supplies in. So we've got sort of simultaneous operations going on here down at Camp Mccall, an airborne invasion going on, an air and land invasion going on up at the Southern Pines, back then Southern Pines, now it's the Moore County Municipal Airport. Really interesting stuff. And all this happens right here, which is really neat. So I'm going to go ahead here. All right. Now, not only was it used for like one of the largest mock invasions, but there were other parts of Southern Pines and Pinehurst at the time where there was other objectives that these soldiers would have to go out and sort of, what's a nice term, what's a gentle, would have to action. That's a beautiful term, ma'am. Thank you. And the whole community was involved. You'd see a lot of people in the community. You'd see soldiers would come up to Southern Pines and try to fraternize with the young Southern ladies in the hopes of and I don't know what, you know, maybe a movie at Frank's. But very bustling. Most of them would come up here. A lot of them would go to Fayetteville before Fayetteville sort of exploded over there in Cross Creek. Now, this is U.S. Army Airborne history has saved this is what sort of saved the Airborne. The Airborne was not, it was not a done deal that we were going to go ahead and sort of drop paratroopers on the Normandy invasion because it was high risk. It was extremely high risk. And so you had to get some folks that were willing to say, you know, I'm going to give it a shake. I'll try this. There's a big difference between throwing out a 180-pound sandbag and a 180-pound, you know, human being. As we can tell, based off of the successes, Moore County, boy, I tell you what, we've done some amazing, amazing things. And it's just grateful that the Historical Society is here to kind of capture this, and great guys that are in the audience and gals that know a little bit more.
Can I ask you?
Yes, ma'am.
That picture that you just had up there.
Yeah.
Are those ships? Yeah.
Yes.
So,
So obviously this is part of the invasion. So what happened, well, the initial plan called for us when we started to hit, you know, these Omaha, Utah, and all these different beaches, it called for us to be able to bring landing craft up and sort of build out piers and docks. However, we were unable to do that. The Corps of Engineers could not build something, and a lot of it had to do with the way the slope of the Normandy coast was. A lot of it had to do with the ships when they were, the transports when they went from the big ships to the little ships that had armored personnel carriers and things like that would sort of get bogged down. And we'd have to build these out really far. So day two and a half, they decided they're going to pull up these landing crafts as far as they can, okay, with the high tide, drop the ramp. Now, because this is after the initial invasion, so this is, they're bringing in resupplies, okay, they're bringing in supplies. And they would drop them right there. You could see them roll right out the back of these large transport vessels, okay, and then when the high tide came and the ships started to get, we got a little higher, the water come, and they just float right back out to England. Well, where's my pointer? So, what you're seeing is the water's right here. You see the water line? Does everybody see that water line?
yes, yes.
Yeah, you can see. You see the water line now? It's tough. This is black and white. I'm not sure my son would be able to decipher this picture. You know, he's got color but yeah. So that's exactly it. And I know my wife and I, we've actually walked this terrain. It's beautiful. When I will tell you, when I served in the military with the Army Rangers, when we redid the scaling of the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, absolutely amazing. Where the bombs had blown up from the naval gunfire, they've kept those crevices. Okay, and it's sort of like a park. It's a living park. And again, this is made possible because of the great things that were done, I believe, here in Moore County. I mean, this is not successful if we don't have the ability and the community to buy into this. This is a huge undertaking. Because when you bring in an outside force to a small community, there could be some adverse side effects. And fortunately, it was minimalized. But yeah. Any other questions? I'm sorry if I went on too long, ma'am. I apologize. You got me into military history, and that tickles my fancy.
Can you go back one more picture?
Yeah, ma'am, I can absolutely.
All right, down here in the bottom
Left.
is my left.
Yes,
Are
ma'am.
those gliders?
Oh, absolutely. So, yeah, great question, which we don't use anymore. Thank God. So we had airborne, we had gliders, and we had air-land operations. And so the concept, although very interesting, it had some flaws, but it worked out well. You would, you know, as the invading force was coming across the channel, you'd send the paratroopers over the night before once dark hit, and then behind the paratroopers would come these gliders. And inside the gliders would be about a platoon's worth of men and equipment. And they were being pulled along by a plane in front of them. And then when they got over their intended target, Now, you have to take into account air, wind, and everything. So they'd glide right in, and they would land on the ground. And then everybody would come out. Okay, and so that's sort of the glider and the air-land concept. So you'd have paratroopers who'd be able to land first, secure some of the ground, and then the gliders would come in. And these gliders, they landed here, out in the fields all across southern Moore County, Pinehurst, and Southern Pines. Interesting. Great question. I almost, any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I just want to make a comment. The plane crashed in the Hudson River. The pilot piloted that plane down, had previously been a glider pilot.
Wow.
And his wife said that was the reason he was able just to ease that plane down. He didn't dive it into the water, he just landed it flat on its belly.
That's amazing. Whew. Yeah, I don't know if I would have been a glider guy. I'll stick to just jumping out. 50-50 chance, right? Okay, so we talked early on, a little bit lighter of a topic. A meteor landed here in Moore County. I think this is a great way to end this, because in 1913, I could only imagine something falling out of the sky. What would everybody was thinking? There wasn't a whole lot of planes in the sky at the time. So we had this 4-pound meteor, and it burrowed its way into the earth about 24 inches and became known as the Moore meteorite. Okay? Now, even though that's an interesting sort of little fact, I think what's really more interesting is what they did with the meteor after the fact. And so it was cut in half. One section's in the Smithsonian Museum, and the other's in the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. So, I mean, we've sort of touched on every aspect of humanity we possibly can. So I think if I was sort of to kind of sum this up, there are a ton of great things, and these were just small snippets. And there's a ton of knowledge. There's a wealth of knowledge that sort of sits here in the within you all, and we got to just make sure we kind of capture it. Sir.
Where did it land?
Ah, great question. Moore County. No, I actually. It landed on Glendon Carthage Road. Yeah. It was a farm at the time, and the farmer's name was George Graves. Okay, 1913. Interesting, great question. Because we all drive sort of, Carthage Road here and there. And I'm pretty sure that now every time, and so ever since I started reading the book and I started looking at all this stuff, every time I go by something, I actually recite the history, and then I try to learn one more thing about the history, because I know somebody else has a little bit more knowledge about these topics, and it's probably one of you all. So, really, we're at the hour mark. Are there any questions? If there's anything you would like, if we need to do this better, or you want me to kind of go back and get some information and pass on to the, we got a great historical society here.
This
Yes?
is a great program.
Yeah, it
Thank
was.
you.
Great program.
Yeah.